Michael Carter sat frozen in his driveway, staring at a house that was supposed to make him feel safe. 58 years old, no mortgage, no car payments, no credit card debt. And yet his hands were gripping the steering wheel like a man about to lose everything. Because 10 minutes earlier, a younger coworker had called him with news that quietly shattered something inside him. Another round of layoffs was coming. And suddenly, Michael realized something terrifying. If his paycheck disappeared, he didn't actually know how long they would survive comfortably. That realization hit him so hard because it made no logical sense. The house behind him was worth almost $900,000. He had spent over 20 years sacrificing for it. Extra mortgage payments, canceled vacations, smaller holidays, delayed dreams. Weekend overtime shifts, years of saying, maybe next year. All for one goal: own the house outright. And technically, he won. But sitting there alone in that driveway, Michael began asking himself a question millions of Americans quietly avoid asking. If the house is fully paid off, then why does freedom still feel so far away? And honestly, this is one of the strangest financial traps in modern America. Because there are people living inside $500,000 homes right now, checking retirement calculators in secret, terrified of medical bills, afraid of losing jobs they hate, while still being told they are financially successful. That contradiction is what this entire video is about. And if you've ever felt like you're doing everything responsible financially, but still don't feel calm about the future, this conversation may hit closer to home than you expect. And before we go deeper, subscribe to Nora Money Mind if you enjoy calm, psychologically honest conversations about money, freedom, investing, retirement, and the hidden emotional patterns that quietly shape people's financial lives. Because most financial advice teaches math, very few conversations explain behavior. And behavior is usually where people either build freedom or slowly lose it without realizing. Now, here's what makes Michael's story so emotionally complicated. He was not irresponsible, not even close. He wasn't gambling money away. He wasn't buying luxury watches. He wasn't drowning in consumer debt. He wasn't pretending to be rich online. In fact, most people would probably call him financially disciplined. That's what makes this story uncomfortable. Because the biggest financial mistakes are often the ones society praises while you're making them. Michael spent decades believing he was building safety. But what he eventually discovered was that safety and freedom are not always the same thing. And once you understand the difference, you start seeing middle-class life very differently, especially in America. Because from the time many people are children, they hear the same financial message repeated over and over again. Pay off your house early. Debt is dangerous. Own your home outright. The mortgage is the enemy. And emotionally, those ideas feel incredibly comforting. A paid-off home represents stability, responsibility, maturity, and protection. It feels permanent, solid, safe. But there's another side to this conversation that almost nobody talks about openly. A house can store wealth without creating freedom. And that distinction changes entire lives, because wealth trapped inside walls is very different from wealth creating income, flexibility, or options. That's the hidden tension most homeowners don't fully realize until much later. And to understand how Michael ended up here, you have to go backward almost 25 years, back when he and his wife Rebecca bought what they proudly called their forever home. At the time, Michael was 34 years old, living in Denver, Colorado. He worked in logistics management. Rebecca worked part-time in healthcare administration while helping raise their 2 kids. And honestly, they looked like the definition of middle-class success. Good neighborhood, good schools, stable careers, retirement accounts, reliable income. The kind of family most people assume is financially secure. But underneath that image was something Michael rarely admitted out loud. He was deeply afraid of debt. Not financially, emotionally. And those are two completely different things. Because when Michael was a kid, he watched his father nearly lose their family home during a recession in the early 1980s. He still remembered the stress in the house, the silence at dinner, the late-night arguments, the unopened bills, the fear in his mother's face whenever the phone rang. And without realizing it, Michael carried that fear into adulthood. So when he bought his own house years later, he made a quiet promise to himself. I will never let debt control my life. At first, that mindset seemed responsible, even admirable. Michael attacked the mortgage aggressively. Every tax refund went toward principal. Every work bonus disappeared into extra payments. Raises increased mortgage overpayments instead of investments. Vacations became shorter. Spending became tighter. And emotionally, every extra payment felt incredible. Because reducing the mortgage balance gave Michael something deeper than financial progress. It gave him emotional relief. That's an important distinction, and honestly, one of the most dangerous things about personal finance is that people often mistake emotional relief for financial optimization. Those are not always the same thing. In fact, sometimes they move in completely opposite directions. And this is where another couple enters the story. David and Lauren Mitchell. Same city, similar income, same approximate age, but a completely different philosophy. David and Lauren also bought a home around the same time. The difference was they bought a smaller one. Not because they couldn't afford more, because they viewed housing differently. To them, the house was not the center of the financial plan. It was one piece of it. And instead of aggressively trying to eliminate their mortgage as fast as possible, they focused heavily on investing alongside it. Retirement accounts, index funds, brokerage investments, long-term compounding. Now, immediately, some people hearing this will think, so are you saying paying off a house is bad? No. And that's where this conversation becomes more nuanced than internet financial debates usually are. Because this is not about declaring one strategy universally right and the other universally wrong. This is about understanding trade-offs, and most people never fully examine the trade-offs emotionally. Michael optimized for certainty. David optimized for flexibility. Michael wanted the emotional peace of ownership. David wanted assets that could eventually produce income independent of his labor. Neither man felt irrational at the time, but over decades, those different emotional priorities quietly created very different futures. And this is where I want to ask you something genuinely important. What feels more emotionally comforting to you personally? Owning your home outright as fast as possible, or having larger investments and more liquidity, even if a mortgage still exists? Because your answer to that question probably reveals more about your financial psychology than your income does. And honestly, most people never stop long enough to examine why they answer the way they do. That's why this topic becomes so emotionally charged. Because housing is never just about math. It's about identity, security, childhood memories, fear, status, control. And the deeper this story goes, the more Michael slowly realizes something uncomfortable. His obsession with paying off the house was never only about money. It was about trying to eliminate uncertainty from life itself. But uncertainty never fully disappears. Not with a paid-off house. Not with retirement accounts. Not even with wealth. And ironically, the harder some people chase absolute financial certainty, the more trapped they eventually begin to feel. Because freedom is not only about what you own, it's also about what your money allows your life to become. Over the next few years, Michael is about to discover the painful difference between looking financially successful and actually feeling financially free. Because for a long time, Michael believed he was winning. Every year the mortgage balance dropped, he felt stronger, safer, more in control. At 40 years old, he crossed below $200,000 remaining on the mortgage and celebrated harder than he celebrated his own promotions. At 44, he refinanced into a lower interest rate and immediately began sending even larger payments. At 47, he calculated that if they stayed disciplined, they could eliminate the mortgage almost 10 years early. That became the mission. And when a financial goal becomes emotional, people stop questioning whether the goal still makes sense. That's one of the most important ideas in this entire video. Because once people emotionally identify with a financial strategy, changing direction starts feeling like betrayal, even when the numbers change, even when life changes, even when the economy changes. Michael stopped seeing the mortgage as a financial tool. He started seeing it as the source of his anxiety itself. So naturally, he believed eliminating it would eliminate the fear. But life is rarely that simple. And this is where the hidden trade-off slowly began unfolding. While Michael aggressively attacked his mortgage, David and Lauren kept doing something emotionally harder. They kept investing consistently. Even during uncomfortable years, even during market crashes, even during recessions. And emotionally, that strategy felt much less satisfying in the short term. Because when you send extra money toward a mortgage, you see immediate progress. The balance shrinks, the debt falls, the ownership percentage rises. It feels tangible, controlled, guaranteed. But investing often feels emotionally unrewarding at first. The market fluctuates. The future feels uncertain. The growth is invisible for years. And psychologically, humans struggle to stay committed to things that do not provide immediate emotional reassurance. That's why so many financially intelligent people still make emotionally driven money decisions. Because personal finance is rarely just numbers. It's nervous system management. And if you've ever made a financial decision mainly because it helped you feel calmer immediately, you are not alone. In fact, comment below. Have you ever chosen emotional peace over mathematical optimization financially? Because almost everyone does this in some form. Some people overpay mortgages, some avoid investing, some hoard cash, some stay in jobs they hate because predictability feels safer than possibility. Fear shapes more financial behavior than most people realize. And honestly, this is why conversations about money online often become shallow. People argue about good debt, bad debt, pay off your house, never pay off your house. But very few people ask the deeper question: what emotional need is this financial decision trying to satisfy? That question changes everything. Because Michael's story was never really about a mortgage. It was about fear. The fear of instability, the fear of humiliation, the fear of uncertainty, the fear of repeating his parents' struggles. And over time, those fears quietly shaped the architecture of his entire financial life. By age 52, Michael and Rebecca had become known among friends as the smart couple, the disciplined couple, the financially responsible couple. People admired them constantly. Coworkers complimented their discipline, family members praised their sacrifice. Neighbors talked about how impressive it was that they were close to fully owning such an expensive home. And externally, the validation felt good. But internally, something strange was happening to Michael. Despite all the progress, he never actually felt finished. The closer he got to paying off the house, the more obsessed he became with reaching the finish line. Because emotionally, he had attached too much hope to what the payoff represented. He wasn't just paying off a loan anymore. He was chasing emotional safety itself. And that's dangerous, because no single financial milestone can permanently remove uncertainty from life. Not a paid-off house, not $1 million, not retirement, not even financial independence. Life always remains uncertain, and people who build their entire emotional stability around reaching one future milestone often feel strangely empty once they arrive there. That realization hit Michael harder than he expected, especially the night they finally paid the house off. Rebecca cried when they opened the final mortgage statement. Their children congratulated them. Friends celebrated them. Michael stood in the living room looking around the house with tears in his eyes, believing something profound had finally changed. For the first time in decades, nobody owned their home except them. And honestly, that moment was beautiful. It mattered. This is important to say because too many financial conversations online strip away human emotion completely. Paying off a home can absolutely create peace. For many people, it genuinely improves sleep, lowers anxiety, and creates emotional stability. That matters. But here's the problem Michael didn't anticipate. The emotional relief faded faster than expected, and reality slowly returned. Property taxes still existed. Insurance costs kept rising. Healthcare expenses increased every year. Groceries became more expensive. Rebecca worried constantly about retirement. And most importantly, Michael still needed his job. That was the part that emotionally crushed him, because he realized something nobody had prepared him for. Owning the house did not automatically create income. The house had value, but it did not produce freedom by itself. And for the first time in years, Michael started quietly comparing his life to David's. At first, he resisted it, because David still had a mortgage. That alone made Michael instinctively believe he was financially ahead. But then strange details started bothering him. David reduced his working hours at 57. Lauren stopped commuting daily and started a consulting business from home. They traveled more often. They seemed calmer, lighter, less financially tense. And what confused Michael most was this. David never seemed obsessed with proving financial security. Because he didn't need to. His investments had quietly been compounding for over 20 years. While Michael was aggressively reducing liabilities, David had been aggressively building assets. That difference becomes enormous over long periods of time, especially because compound growth behaves strangely. For years, it barely feels noticeable. Then eventually, it accelerates dramatically. And this is why opportunity cost becomes so dangerous emotionally. Because you usually do not feel it while it's happening. You only recognize it later, when comparing alternate outcomes. That's exactly what started happening to Michael. One afternoon, he sat down and ran rough calculations. And honestly, the numbers made him feel sick. Not because he was poor, but because he realized how different their future might have looked if even part of those aggressive mortgage overpayments had been invested consistently instead. A few $100s monthly, then $1,000, then $2,000, year after year after year, compounding quietly in the background while Michael focused almost entirely on home equity. And this is where many middle-class Americans unknowingly trap themselves financially. They become equity rich, but cash flow poor. Their wealth exists mostly on paper, inside property values, inside retirement projections, inside illiquid assets. But their actual monthly flexibility remains fragile. That's why someone can technically have a high net worth while still feeling terrified of losing a paycheck. And emotionally, that contradiction creates enormous confusion. Because society teaches people to measure wealth visually. Big house, nice neighborhood, paid-off property. But real financial freedom often looks much quieter than that. Sometimes freedom looks like smaller housing costs, larger investments, more liquidity, lower stress, and the ability to walk away from work without panic. That's why some people making moderate incomes eventually become freer than people making much larger salaries. Because freedom depends less on appearance and more on financial flexibility over time. And honestly, this is the part of the story where many viewers begin feeling emotionally uncomfortable. Because deep down, they recognize pieces of themselves in Michael. Not necessarily the exact numbers, but the psychology, the desire to finally feel safe, the belief that one milestone will remove anxiety permanently, the hope that responsible financial behavior will eventually create emotional certainty. But certainty is slippery. People reach income goals and still worry, reach savings goals and still worry, pay off houses and still worry. Because financial anxiety is not always caused by math alone. Sometimes it's rooted in identity. And Michael slowly began understanding something painful. He had spent decades trying to protect himself emotionally from uncertainty, while accidentally reducing some of the very flexibility that could have helped him navigate uncertainty later. That realization changed how he viewed the house completely. For years, he saw it as the ultimate symbol of freedom. Now, he started seeing it differently, not as a mistake, but as an incomplete strategy. And that distinction matters, because this video is not saying, never pay off your house. That would be simplistic. The deeper lesson is balance. A home can absolutely be part of a healthy financial life, but problems begin when the home becomes the only financial priority while investing weakens, liquidity disappears, retirement contributions shrink, and flexibility slowly erodes. That's when people unknowingly build lives that appear successful externally while internally feeling financially trapped. And this becomes especially dangerous near retirement age, because retirement changes the rules emotionally. During your working years, a paid-off home feels powerful because income still enters monthly. But later in life, the question changes completely. The question becomes, can your assets support your life without requiring constant labor? That is a very different problem, and many people discover too late that home equity alone does not automatically solve it. Especially when most wealth remains trapped inside a property they emotionally cannot imagine leaving. That emotional attachment becomes incredibly important. Because houses are not just financial assets, they are memory containers. People raise children there, celebrate holidays there, survive difficult years there. And over time, leaving the home can start feeling emotionally equivalent to losing part of yourself. That's why downsizing becomes psychologically difficult for many retirees, even when it makes financial sense. The house stops being just property. It becomes identity. And identity-driven financial decisions are often the hardest to evaluate objectively. Michael realized this one evening while walking through the house after Rebecca had fallen asleep. He stood in the hallway looking at old family photos, the kids growing up, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school graduations, and suddenly he understood why he had fought so hard to own this house outright. It wasn't really about real estate. It was about permanence, control, protection. The feeling that he had built something nobody could take away, and honestly, that realization made him emotional. Because his younger self was not foolish. His younger self was afraid. There's a difference. And I think many people watching this understand that feeling deeply, especially people who grew up around financial instability. Because when you grow up watching money create chaos, you often spend adulthood trying to build emotional armor against uncertainty. But sometimes that armor becomes so heavy it limits movement itself. That's exactly what happened to Michael. And the breaking point came several months after the layoffs were announced. A longtime employee at Michael's company lost his position unexpectedly after 26 years. No dramatic warning, no emotional goodbye, just a meeting, a severance package, and suddenly a career was over. That moment shook Michael deeply, because for the first time, he realized loyalty to employers does not guarantee security, and neither does a paid-off house by itself. Security had to become broader than that, more adaptable than that. That realization led to one of the most important conversations Michael and Rebecca ever had. Late one night, they sat together quietly discussing retirement again, and for the first time in years, Michael admitted something out loud he had never fully confronted before. "I think I confused being debt-free with being free." And Rebecca didn't argue, because deep down, she felt it too. That silence between them mattered, because it marked the moment the entire philosophy of their financial life began changing. Not radically, not recklessly, but thoughtfully. They stopped viewing the house as the final destination and started viewing it as one tool among many. That shift changed everything psychologically. Instead of obsessing over ownership alone, they started prioritizing flexibility, liquidity, income stability, optionality. And eventually, after months of difficult discussions, they made a decision that would have once felt emotionally impossible. They downsized. Not out of failure, not out of desperation, out of strategy. And emotionally, the decision was complicated. Selling the house hurt. Because they were not just leaving property behind, they were leaving memories, versions of themselves, entire decades of life. But something unexpected happened afterward. The pressure in Michael's chest slowly began disappearing. Because for the first time in years, he no longer felt trapped maintaining a lifestyle built around appearances of security. The released equity strengthened their retirement accounts. Their cash reserves improved dramatically. Monthly expenses decreased, and most importantly, Michael stopped making decisions from fear. That was the real transformation. Not the money itself, the psychology. Because true financial freedom is rarely about eliminating every uncertainty from life. It's about building enough flexibility that uncertainty stops controlling every decision you make. That's a much calmer way to live. And honestly, probably a much healthier one too. Now, to be clear, none of this means everyone should keep mortgages forever. For some people, paying off debt early genuinely improves quality of life. Peace matters. Emotional stability matters. Sleep matters. Personal finance is deeply personal. But what matters most is understanding the trade-offs honestly. Not blindly following financial ideology. Not copying internet personalities. Not making decisions based entirely on fear or social validation. But actually asking, what kind of life is this financial decision helping me build over time? Because wealth is not only about net worth. It's about income flexibility, adaptability, resilience, control over time, and the ability to navigate uncertainty without constant panic. That's a much deeper definition of wealth than most people are taught. And maybe that's the biggest lesson underneath Michael's story. The house itself was never truly the problem. The real problem was believing one financial milestone could permanently create emotional safety. Nothing can fully do that. Not money, not houses, not careers. Life remains uncertain for everyone, but some financial choices increase flexibility within uncertainty, while others quietly reduce it. And unfortunately, many middle-class people spend decades optimizing for appearances of safety, while unintentionally weakening the flexibility that actually creates freedom later. That's the hidden house mistake almost nobody talks about. And it doesn't always look dangerous while it's happening. In fact, sometimes it looks incredibly responsible. That's what makes it so powerful psychologically. So if this conversation connected with you in some way, subscribe to Nora Money Mind, because the next video may completely change how you think about another financial habit millions of Americans mistake for security, even while it quietly drains years of freedom underneath the surface.